These lights are like blinding me. So I'll hide in the corner here. There we go. Does that work? Just hear a voice of the doctor. You going yet?
Yeah, we're going.
Excellent. So let's go ahead and get started. My presentation, Plunder. I got the microphone. You don't hear it?
Oh, yeah, I do.
Okay. Okay. So Plunder Pillage and Print. Actually, there's like a back screen splash in there of Vikings burning the ship, but it's kind of washing it out. So the art of leveraging multifunction printers during penetration testing. So my name is Dera. I work for Rapid7 as a pen tester, consultant. I've been doing this for a number of years. I've been in IT for over 20 years. Been doing the pen testing for about 7 years now. So as we're going through this thing, I have a whole bunch of slides here. And usually my take on it, who cares about the slides? The main thing I'm always looking for is everyone gets something out of this. You learn something, you take something away. So if you're a pen tester, you'll come out of this with maybe some new ideas, some things to look at while you're doing assessments or pen testing. If you maintain security of a corporation, you'll get some ideas on how to protect yourself. So the slides are for something for me to talk about if you guys are boring. So let's interact. Let's not bore me, and that way I don't have to keep looking at the slides. And let's not ask too many questions. What's the question? He's making a copy of his ass. She's jealous because it was her turn.
Waiting in line.
It actually says, hey, I thought it was my turn, but it kind of washed out. So that used to be a cool thing to do until people started busting the glasses on them with their fat asses. So what are we going to talk about today? Obviously, multifunction printers as an attack vector. Some attack examples, how to automate the attack, because that's what this presentation was about. I've been doing this for a number of years, which we're going to discuss as we move forward. But we've been releasing some various Metasploit modules on a new project we're working on for migrating some tools that we developed years back over into Metasploit and doing some cool stuff with it. So this is what we're going to be talking about. So why multifunction printers? I mean, it's a big thing. So why are we doing this? So what is it that pen testers are looking for? I don't know about you, but I'm looking for username data, so I can break into systems or do brute forces. I'm looking for passwords. That's totally cool. But the ultimate goal is we want to get shell, right? Do we all want to get shell? Okay, so that's the whole purpose. So the goal here is I'm going to teach you how to get information that can help you get access to other core systems within a Windows, Microsoft environment by leveraging multifunction printers. So a little bit of history about this. Like I said, I've been doing this for a number of years, 4 or 5 years. When we initially started this project back in 2010, we were actually able to gain access to Windows Active Directory environments by extracting data from multifunction printers about 10 to 15% of the time. So that was 4 years ago. So we jump forward 2014, we're able to now to gain access to Active Directory environments by extracting usable credential data from multifunction printers 40 to 50% of the time. So I walk into a company, now obviously I walk into a company that has 10 employees and 1 printer, the odds of that are pretty low. But if we go into any mid-sized or large companies starting at 1,000 employees or higher that have some fairly current printers, larger multifunction enterprise business printers, that is 45 to 50% of the time we're able to get Active Directory credentials off those multifunction printers and leverage it to gain elevated access. And of course, a number of times, about 5% of the time, we're actually able to get those printers to give up domain admin creds, because obviously the person that configured them is a dumbass. But that's another topic. So we're going to move from there. Again, why multifunction printers? So what are we looking for? What can we get off this? What is the possibility, and why is it possible? So we can get usage tracking records off devices that can give us usernames. We're going to talk about that. We can look at scan to email setups configurations. We can look at scan to file function configurations on multifunction printers. We can look at LDAP authentications on these multifunction printers. And of course, we can look at various firmware attacks, which you're always hearing about new and current firmware attacks against various embedded devices, including multifunction printers. But it turns out so many of these features, these functions here, If the printer's configured to integrate within the business environment, those are configured. If not, you need to talk to your overall company's plans and policies and ask them, why do we just spend $15,000 for a printer to print, only print? These are business functions and features that should be leveraged in your environment, but they also should be secured. But what we typically find is they're not secured, and we're able to extract data from these. Any questions so far? Everybody with me? Yeah, nod heads. Hold up a beer. Good. So the first one we want to talk about, since it's plunder, pillage, and print, we're going to talk about plundering. So plunder is the ability to rob, steal goods, take by force, which is generally what we're doing. So we can pull user data. So what kind of data can we pull during these assessments? We can pull usernames, application data, and host name information from multifunction printers. A couple examples. Dell's. Most of the Dell, even the small win ones, give up usernames, application information, and client host name information. Xerox's give up usernames and application data. HP's give up username and application data. Now, how's this work? So if we come over here and we look at the Dell, man, this is like washed out really bad. I need to crank that down a little bit because you can't see nothing on the presentation. So I will point where data should be. So there we go. That would actually be the job name. And that would contain information that may actually include information like the applications that are actually used. So from these printers, we can identify what kind of applications may exist in the business environment. The owner. This information is actually going to be Windows usernames. A lot of these devices, multifunction printers, small end printers, will actually record your information, specifically in a lot of the color printers, as an example. The color printers, there's always this chargeback. There's an extra cost to color printers. And of course, no company has black and white printers anymore. They seem to always be color because they just like to throw money away. But what it does is it'll record your Active Directory username in that environment. The attacker can just request. He doesn't have to authenticate. No matter how secure your printer is, this data is going to be given up. So I can get all your usernames that have actually used that printer since the last time it was rebooted. And it can be quite significant. We've used it a number of times when we've been in hardened environments where basically, we couldn't get nothing. They had hardened everything down. So our only attack vector would be your typical password brute forcing attack within the environment. All we have to do is quickly query a printer, pull off all the usernames, throw those against your Active Directory with standard brute force. And what is the current password of the quarter? Everyone know what the password of the quarter is? 14. Yes, summer 14. And of course, in the winter, it'll be winter 14. Of course, the first character is going to be uppercase, so you meet standard best password practices. And of course, host name information, which could be information related to the specific host that the person connected from, which would be more attack vector information. Moving from there, looking at the Xerox devices, we get the same thing. We get the job name. I don't know if you guys, this actually says Crystal Reports as an example. We get the owner information, which again is the Active Directory information. User IDs that can be leveraged. And of course, we haven't got to the fun stuff yet. We'll eventually get there. We need to start low and work to the evil, okay? So just be patient with me. So we jump over here in HPs, and everybody has these low-end HPs or even the small color HPs on their network. And remember, every time you use that, your Active Directory username is actually being recorded in the logs. And also the job type, which here you can see it says Outlook, PDF. So we get an idea of the actual applications that are being used in the environment so that you can carry out further attacks against the environment. So you know if they're using certain versions of products or certain products, you can target them for various vulnerabilities. And of course you got the username, which if you pack the last part of the company's name and .com in there, you basically have their email address. So let's move on to some more funner stuff. Let's look at pillage. Let's get a little more brutal. This is we're going to do all the most evil stuff and try to go for some cool stuff here. The first thing we want to look at is some address book extraction attacks. So we have any questions so far? I want to make sure everyone's with me. No one's confused. Okay, that's good.
What if we're confused and just not about what you said?
You're always confused, man.
Okay.
So when we're dealing with address books, some of the things we can get off these devices. Usernames as an example. We've already talked about that. We can get that. We can also get full email address information off these devices a lot of times out of address books. But the one thing most people don't realize that a number of these high-end multifunction devices also can store passwords in the address books. Now typically when you log onto one of these devices through the web admin console and you go to the address books, you're not going to see these passwords, nor are you going to be able to typically manipulate those passwords directly from that address book. But what you can do is you can extract these address books, and if you ask the printer nicely, in most cases, it will give you the passwords. So we're going to talk about two different devices types. Canon Minoltas, high-end devices, and we're going to look at, Konica Minoltas and the Canon Image Runner Advanced versions. First one we're going to look at is the Image Runner Advanced version. So from here, the address books, you can export the passwords in the address books, but it's going to require special settings. It's not going to do it out of the gate. The reason why that is it's something they fixed because of what I did to them before. Wonder why? Because I did this attack when I first released this stuff for the old Canon devices. And it turned out I didn't even have to say, give me the passwords. I just had to pull the address books and have it export it, and the passwords would just be there. So they did two cool things. They decided that we're going to stop Dera. We're going to make you request the passwords. And then what we're going to do is we're actually going to encrypt the passwords so that when you do get the passwords, they're going to be encrypted. So only the machine will understand them when you import them into the machine. And if somebody gets that data, they won't be able to easily do it unless they know the encryption schema, blah, 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 all the fun stuff. But it turns out the encryption process is actually controlled in the post request. So we can turn it off. So let's look at this. Like I said, I agree. Sorry this is kind of washed out, but I think we can see the key stuff. So go into the Canon Image Runner Advanced. We're looking at a 6055, which is a fairly advanced high-end Canon multifunction printer. And we have to go to this location here, and we go include passwords when exporting address books. A little checkbox, so we're going to check that, okay? So we're going to go ahead, and then we're going to go to the next page. And this is the page where we can start the export, and it's going to ask us for a password as part of the encryption. So it ties into the whole encryption routine. So when it encrypts it and you go to import it back into another printer, it's going to ask you for that password, and that way they have this vague sense of security. So we move from there, and what we get out of there is, I don't know, anyone actually see that? It's basically a big base 64 string of data. Now this is actually encrypted data. It's just been base 64 so it can be passed as text into a text file, because that's what the export process is. So we could see that we can get the passwords out of the device, and this happened to be a scan the file function that was configured for a specific user. But it turns out it's actually encrypted. So if we look at the post process, we capture the entire post process, and we look down here, we see this thing called ENC_mode. So what do we think that does? How about encrypt mode? I don't know if they didn't think we could figure this out. I'm really not sure what they were going with this. But what would happen if we change it to 0? So we change this to 0, run the exact same thing we did before, and now we have the password in plain text. So easy enough, we go to the printer, we ask nicely, give me your address books. We ask nicely again, give me all your passwords. And then we capture the post process and we say, nah, I don't want this encrypt mode. Let's set it to 0 because we don't like it. And next thing you know, we're able to extract the entire address book. Yes, sir?
Will that mean that it's just not stored on the printer encrypted at all anyway?
So the interesting part is I'm not sure. I have not been inside the printer itself. I'm sorry. The question was, does this mean that it wasn't stored encrypted inside the printer, like on storage on the printer? And the answer is, I don't know. More than likely, it's kind of a catch-22. All the main manufacturers are doing whole disk encryption on their devices now, almost by default. So if you pull the disk out and run out the door with it, you're probably not going to get to data because the whole thing's going to be encrypted. Okay, but if you actually able to gain a shell to that device and look at it when it was in the running state, when it was fully decrypted, I'm not sure what the state would be on the Canon. In Xerox printers, it is stored encrypted. All passwords except for one, which we're going to talk about later, is actually stored encrypted on the device, because that's the only one I've actually got shell on. So I'm not sure about this particular one, but definitely a good question. So if you ever find out, let me know. I'm interested in the answer. So Pwn, there you go. We got that data. So what will we get out of this? What I typically see in here is individual users can be set up to do scan the file functions. And the way that would work is they would walk up to the device and they would go, hey, I get this scan job and I want it to save it in my folder. So this would be configured for scan the file functionality. They could easily pin in at the front of the printer, do the scan job, and it would save it in their Active Directory folder using creds. It could either be global creds, which could be elevated. It could be their actual creds. I've seen that in the devices. And also the functionality of scan to email. How many people have actually received emails from printers? And it's quite common now. That's the type of stuff we're stealing. That printer typically can be configured, not always. Sometimes they set them up to be anonymous to the printers. But a lot of times I find those configured. But if they pin into the device, they also have LDAP settings. So you can always steal LDAP settings, and we'll talk about stealing LDAP settings here in a few minutes. So moving there to the Konica Minolta. In this case, we're not, it is the address book sort of, but we're making a request for a specific functions within all the address books. Turns out this is not accessible via the web console at all. At least I've never been able to find it. What we did find it was a friend of mine, one of the guys that I worked with at the FUFASnet guys, was on an assessment, and he fired up a Konica management tool that's available from Konica for managing globally all their printers. And he fired this up, and he started watching it, and he was able to extract some critical data, usernames and passwords, out of it using their tool. Well, he went ahead and piped everything through Burp and captured all the transactions and sent them to me so I could do some further development, figure out how all this thing worked. Well, it turns out that all the communications between the Konica management tool and the device is done through SOAP message transactions. This is done over a TCP port 50,001 for non-SSL and 50,003 for SSL. And the way this thing works, this one you can actually see a little bit better. The first thing you need to do is authenticate to the actual printer. So this is the entire SOAP message, and if someone wants these slides, if they don't put them up, just shoot me an email and I'll make them available for you. You can actually take this raw data right here and just send it to a printer with the right username and password. Now the default one is admin, and the password is 123456778. That's usually fairly easy to remember. So everyone got that password memorized. There'll be a test at the end. Just checking. So from there, what it kicks back is what's known as a validation auth key, a session token, session cookie for no better purposes. And what we do is we turn around and we take that and we use that to post this particular message here. I know it's a lot, but this is a operator info request. We post that to it for these specific offsets and links. And the cool thing is it actually dumps to us all the passwords in plain text straight off. So in this particular example, we're actually able to pull Samba password. You know, it gives the file name, it gives the username, the password, the folder that you get accessible to. So we're able to get all this information for the simple mail transfer protocol access that it tries to do, SMB or FTP transactions. Nice? You like that? Okay. We've automated a lot of this, so we're going to talk about that a little later on. It'll make it a little easier for you, in case you didn't memorize all those SOAP messages. So any questions moving from here? Okay. So the next one is the passback attack. I love this. This is totally cool. I've talked about it before. We've written a paper on it. The passback attack is fairly simple. We're targeting the printer's authentication services. We're actually typically going to try to pull LDAP. We can pull FTP, and we can also pull SNB with this. But 99.9% of the time, we usually target LDAP because we usually find LDAP configured on the printers. Because if they're using some of those other functionalities or settings where the user comes up and pins onto it or has some other authentication access to the printer for himself, the printer will actually do LDAP lookups. Just a second. And of course, SMTP. So how does the LDAP passback attack work? So to get this all right, I don't know what we got here. Let's start it. This is an evil hacker if you haven't figured that one out, okay? This one happens to be a printer. I have to explain these pictures, they're totally washed out. And this happens to be the LDAP server. So how's a printer do all of its authentication? It's pretty straightforward. It's going to do an LDAP auth to the LDAP printer. The LDAP printer is going to reply with that LDAP information that it actually requested. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the IP address settings on this particular device because we've gained access to it. We're going to tell it to do an LDAP lookup. Of course, the address we changed is going to point back to us. The printer at that time is nice to do the LDAP lookup and send us the passwords in plain text, which we can capture. It's pretty straightforward, fairly simple attack method. This works on almost all the large printers. We've used this on literally almost every one of them. The big thing is does the printer have the ability to do trigger an LDAP? Can you remotely trigger an LDAP? We know you can on a Xerox. You can on, I'm trying to think of the printers you can do this on. The Ricos. The Ricos have a test function, so you don't actually have to change the IP address of the device. You don't have to save it. So what you have to do is just say, put the IP address in there and go test. Validate your configurations are working before you commit them. Real nice. So you can actually carry out this attack without actually committing anything to it. So an example of this, we can log into a Xerox. Let me look at these slides here. Oh, they're so freaking washed out. Okay, so we have an example here. So we can log into a Color Cube 9303. These are like really pricey $18,000 printers. So what we do is we log into it. We go to the LDAP settings. So everyone know what the password is for a Xerox Color Cube? There you go. It's usually 4 ones for most Xerox. There's some variations, but 4 ones will typically get you in most of the time. Every once in a while, you'll run into somebody who's changed the actual passwords for a Xerox. So we're going to show you in a little bit how to get the password off some of the models. But typically, I found out because the default password's 1111, it creates this mental block in the person configuring it. And he only thinks you can actually put 4 numbers in there as the password. And it's always going to be above 1111. So that makes pretty easy brute forcing. So we come over here to the server IP address configurations and the data we want to get. This is another issue. A number of years when I did this, almost every one of the printers that we dealt with, these high-end printers, we were finding the LDAP configuration data actually stored in the source of the HTML. So you go to this page and just go right-click, read source of page, and you could find the password. So we published all that, and they were like, that's bad. So they fixed the problem. So they set it up so the password's now stored on the device. So the only way to get it off the device is you have to get the device to send it to you. But they messed up because you have to check a box that says change password before you can change the password. But you can literally alter everything else on the page. So now all I have to do is literally change everything on the page to point somewhere else, trigger the LDAP, capture the passwords. So we're after this password setting here, which actually be in memory. So on the Xerox, once you've made your change so your IP address is pointing to you as a hacker, you can fire up Netcat to listen on 389, the LDAP, or you can change that if you want. You also got to make sure that you change it from some of the more advanced secure. They may have it configured for LDAP looking up over SSL. You want to set that, the SSL's off. The thing you may also want to do is actually configure it so that it communicates in plain text, because you'll see NTLM, Kerberos settings, and various other things. You can easily set that to plain text. Fire up Netcat to listen on that port. Jump over here to user map on the Xerox printer, which is an entire LDAP lookup function. Here, just put any kind of data in the search screen, click search. It'll attach out to your device. Let's see. Oh, yeah, this one shows it pretty good. So this shows a complete capture. We fuzzed out some of the stuff that actually was proprietary information, but this is a real attack. It took place on a customer site. I think the password was changed too, just for the sake of it being like the variation. We're in the variation of the company's name, and we had to hide it. But it's real simple, exactly what it looks like. It'll attach out to your device. It'll pass you the username and then the password in plain text. You don't have to have a special session. Regular netcat listening will capture this data in plain text. So we have the same thing on a Sharp. Give you a Sharp example. Basically the same functionality. So we jump over here to the LDAP setup screen and we go to LDAP settings. Pretty straightforward. From there we jump over here, we get to that screen, and we can change the IP address to point to us. And then we have the username you want to get, and of course this is the password, which you have to do a checkbox to change the password. We don't want to change the password. We want to give us the good password so we don't screw with that. And then we click this execute, which is basically a test function. And it'll actually go through the LDAP setting to validate your settings are correct. I really love it that they put these test functions in there because it makes it so much easier because I can hack a printer without actually really changing the configurations. And again, we capture it just like this, pretty straightforward, administrator, and then the password. We're able to capture it in plain text. The 0B is needs to be stripped off. That's an ending character of the LDAP function coming from the Sharp. So then we move. Oh, we're running a little fast. Oh, this will take a little longer. So what time is it by your watch?
35 after.
35 after.
3:35.
Is that what your watch says? Okay, my watch needs fixed. Okay, so we get to print. Now, this is kind of interesting. So we've done plunder, pillage, but what's evil about print? So we kind of like, screw the printer definition. We got our own definition. To take control of our printer for the purpose of pillaging and plundering, using a print job over port 9100. Now, could you think of anything more fun than just being able to send something to port 9100 on a printer and have it kick back a shell at root level privileges? I thought it was cool. So that was one of my goals. And it was a lot easier with Xerox because they kind of helped me out. So we have this firmware attack. Okay, so we have a firmware attack with the Xerox printer. So a little bit of history. So we're dealing with the work centers, high-end work centers, that their firmware packages use what's known as a DLM, dynamically loadable module. So have you ever been on a Xerox printer and actually done a cloning function to make a copy of it? It's the same thing. It outputs a DLM. So my brain was thinking, you know, if I can do a DLM, which a firmware is a DLM, and the Xerox printer is capable of creating a DLM, the odds are it's probably the same thing. That tells me the code for doing the DLMs is actually on the printer. Thought that was cool. So I may be able to actually generate my own firmware using the printer itself. Well, it turns out if you go out to Xerox, you can download all the firmware packages. You don't have to sell your soul to the devil or have a license agreement. You can get all the firmware packages. The firmware packages are kind of cool. So if you open one up, they have this header here. It starts out with XRX begin and ends with XRX end. So what you need to do is open up that file and just delete those 10 lines in the older versions. I think it's 11 or 12 in the newer versions. And then all it is a tarball. It's nothing else. It's not packed in any special way. So you can just untar this data, which basically gives you the entire printer's software on the device as a standard tarball. So pretty simple. How many people have used tar? You understand how to untar, so pretty straightforward. So it's easy. Strip the header out and untar it. And I recommend you give this a try. It's kind of cool. Because what you end up out of there is you end up with the file structure. So digging through the file structure, remember, we're looking for anything with DLMs, dynamically loadable modules. So if we go to opt-in-C, there's this thing called DLM Toolkit. And I'm thinking, oh, you know, is it really this freaking simple? And it turned out, yes, it was. So if we blow this folder out, we get a couple cool files. We get a thing called DLM Maker. How about DLM stripper? That strips the 10 lines I told you to do manually out. That automatically does it. And a thing called key files. Key files. So I can sign the packages, right? And then SHA-256 deep, which is included, which is part of the hashing routine for signing the packages. Also, if you run DLM Maker, now we got to correct this. So when I originally started doing this, all of the newer firmwares were all for Power PCs. Well, I really didn't want to screw with a Power PC. That's kind of like a pain for me. I just didn't want to set one up or emulate one or any of that type of stuff. So I went back a few years to, I think it was a 5260 printer, which happened to be an x86 base processor on it. I downloaded the software. I broke up the firmware. Turns out all these printers use Wind River Linux. It's kind of an embedded Linux, but they're really not embedded systems. They're full-blown operating systems with hard drives and full operating systems. So I went ahead and I just downloaded the 5260, blew it open on my machine, and look, all the tools would run on my Ubuntu. Problem solved. So if you run DLM Maker, it actually gives you the entire command structure, as a help menu. So now I have the programs for doing the firmware, the DLMs. I have the instructions for doing it. I have all the key files, and I have everything that's used to sign the packages. So what else is left? So let's do a demo. I'm not sure how this is going to look on the screen. That's not too bad. This is washed out a little bit, but I'm hoping everything up in the black area will look okay. So to lay this thing out, here happens to be a 5740 multifunction printer, good $8,000, $10,000 printer, and nice printers. We have this window up here, which we're going to use to actually inject our DLM that we built. And then this side is going to be the Netcat listener that's going to listen to this thing coming in. So I kind of walk you through this. So we're playing around here. We jump over here. We're going to look at jobs. And of course, you can't see them because they're all washed out. In this case, there's no jobs there. So let's speed this thing up a little bit. We'll give you the fast version. So we got Netcat set up right back there. We're going to listen to port 8686. We've created a firmware here called Xerox.dlm using all those tools that they gave me. And the best way to describe this DLM that I built, hold on, I'll halt that real quick. So what did I do? The way the process works is I took a real firmware package and go, okay, if I want to build a firmware package, what's it going to look like? I tore the firmware package down to all of its most simplest pieces, and it turns out that there's one key file. There is a shell script that is run that bootstraps the entire firmware. So easy enough, let's get rid of the entire firmware package and let's just use the shell script. The shell script's defined when you build the DLM, when you say, I want to call my DLM Xerox. When you call it Xerox, the package will build it so that when it hits the printer will validate the signatures by going through the hashing routines. Once it says it's validated, it'll open it up, write it to a file, and it'll execute whatever you named the DLM. If you named it Xerox during the process, it'll run Xerox.sh, and that happens to be the case here. We've named the DLM Xerox, and we also named the process inside Xerox.sh, which is basically a tarred, signed shell script that's going to do nothing but do a bash shell back to our IP address. Fairly simple firmware package. So there, we kick it off, and it kicks back a shell. So if we check who it is, we'll see real quick that I'm actually root on the multifunction printer. If we look down here, the print job will actually show up. Hopefully you can actually see it somewhat. It shows up as a print job right there. You can see it. Decomposing. The job name it gave, 1352. The cool thing here is if you can actually send this attack with various methods. You can send it through a Netcat, or you can send it through line print daemon. If you send it through line print daemon, it's actually going to print your actual name down here. So remember that, because we covered that in an early part of the presentation. Standard print job, it's going to print your name off your machine. So if we jump over here real quick, we're going to check a couple features so you can see what we're looking at here. This happens to be, it's actually Wind River, Linux 2.6.20 on this particular version. So that's cool stuff. We're going to look at the processors. This particular device, even though we use code that we pulled from an earlier machine, it turns out that the signature signing process is the same across, used to be across all Xerox printers. This happens to be a PowerPC processor, E500V2. So you can see the kind of level access we get. Let's see what else we did. Okay. Kind of cut that off a little bit. So we have var op nc config security dot config. So it's a config CFG file. Okay. That's the interesting file that I wanted to mention. As I talked about earlier, all LDAP settings, SMB settings, FTP settings, all those passwords are stored on the device encrypted. We haven't had time to figure out what the encryption is, because it's hard for me to get people to let me just play with a $12,000 printer. But there's one password that is not encrypted on Xerox printers, and that password happens to be stored in this folder and happens to be the console password. So worst case scenario, you run this firmware attack, and we've actually written to automate this, and we'll talk about that a little later. It'll actually go out there, pull this password, and give it to you. Now you can log in and do a passback attack. Pretty straightforward, and then you can get LDAP configs off the device. Any questions? Okay. I think I did one other dump on this. Let's screw down here real quick. Yeah, you can see right there's the password pulled out of the file, and this one hasn't been changed. You can see it's still 1111. Pretty straightforward. If we dig in a little further, I did a strings on memory, and I dumped everything in memory that had the word password in it, just to see if it could be done. And I didn't crash the printer, which is a good thing, so my company didn't fire me. They didn't actually notice I was doing it, which is always a good thing. Okay, so it's a fairly straightforward attack. There is actually a white paper out there on it. Right there, you can pull the white paper down. This will give you detailed instructions step by step by step on how to build this attack, every piece of it, and how it works. We went back and reverse engineered all the code to see how the entire signing process. So in the paper, you can actually sign your own packages to these devices while actually using DLM Maker. I give you instructions on how to do that. And this happens to be all of the printers that have been validated on, that this vulnerability has been validated on. So the new ones, they fixed this, because I kind of contacted them, and it was kind of an interesting conversation. I said, hey, I can build firmware packages for your box, and it's like really simple. Let's talk about it sometime. I gave them a little bit of detail. So they set up a meeting with their whole security team, and I walked through how all this stuff works for them, and it just kind of freaked them out that it was that easy. And I made some smart-ass remark to them, because there had also been a firmware hack that came out against HP, all the HP devices from the guy at Columbia University. And I said, yeah, it was really simple. At HP, it takes an entire team of PhD students to hack their firmware, but it just took one bored hacker 2 hours one afternoon when he didn't have anything better to do. They didn't think that was very funny, but I did. So this whole thing didn't take me long. I theorized it was possible based on what I discovered early on, but when I sat down to actually do the attack, it took me less than 2 to 3 hours to take this thing from concept all the way to full root shell. So it's fairly that simple to actually do. So moving from there, why are we doing this? Like I said, we've been doing this for a number of years, but we've released tools to automate some of this stuff, and we're coming out with some new stuff. We're trying to migrate some new tools out there and make some tools better. So Pareda to Metasploit to Paratasploit. It's kind of where we're going with this project. So I released a tool at SHMU 2011 called Parata. Parata is Latin for plunder, booty, spoils of war. It's currently written in Perl. Right now it enumerates about 103 different devices and doesn't cover every printer out there. I haven't had a chance to hack and build modules for every printer. But it covers a lot of the cool printers, and it can work a large portion of the time. And it can at least get you down to enough information that you can go in there and manually do a few of them also, which is always cool. And basically what it does is it fingerprints the printers using title pages, server types off port 80, and SNMP strings. And the 103 devices also include other embedded devices, because the whole goal was not to be just printers, but to focus on various embedded devices that may have usable data on the network. And we find a number of embedded devices are also configured, as an example, for SNMP. So you go into a company that is really big on SNMP. So they go through and they configure all their printers, or not their printers, but they configure all their cameras throughout the building with SNMP. They configure all their routers, they configure all their switches, they configure all their firewalls with SNMP, but then they fail to actually change the default password on one of their TCP cameras. So we've written modules in some cases that'll go into these devices, check them for default creds. If it has default creds, log into it and pull the SNMP community strings off, which if they've not taken security into consideration and they've used the same SNMP string across their entire environment, now I have a read-write string from a TCP camera that I could play against their routers, switches, and firewalls, especially Cisco's, to pull the actual running configs off the devices remotely. And we've done that way more times than I can even count anymore because of some lame little device on their network that was SNMP enabled that still had the default creds passwords set on it. So how's Parata work? It's real simple. It scans the network for all embedded devices through the web interfaces, the title page, the server type, the SNMP. It fingerprints those, and if it has a matching module that has been written, because it's modular system structured, it'll actually run that module and try to pull that usable data off there and log it. So how we use it. This is interesting. So when we first started doing this, oh gosh, I'm running out of time. So when we first started doing this, I would go to engagement as a pen tester assessment engineer, and I would do all my assessment stuff. And then at the end of the engagement, I would actually run Parata. Let's do this final check, blah, blah, blah. I was just going through the motions. And it was getting more and more common for me to get usable creds off that. I was on an engagement one time where I couldn't gain access to nothing. They had, every device on their network had a different password. Admin was turned off on all the user stations. The whole environment was hardened. I was on the last day of the engagement and I said, well, hell, there's nothing left to do to run this. Now I did break into various machines, but because of some of the issues, I could not elevate my rights and gain access to everything. So I ran this, and it turned around and pulled the address book off a Canon printer, which happened to have a domain admin cred configured into it. So from that day on, the first thing we do is I go into an engagement, we do our nmap scans. I take the gnmap output, because this tool will take input straight from a gnmap output file, feed gnmap into this, and just let it run while I go off and do my other hacking. And then I come back a little later, and I normally have Active Directory creds after an hour or two. And I haven't had to do anything. It's pretty nice, pretty simple, and it gives me a foothold into the environment if I haven't broken into anything else by then. So where are we going with this? We're actually migrating all of Parata's modules over to Metasploit. We've migrated 7 or 8 right now. There's going to be some more coming before the end of the year. We're trying to migrate all the coolest, best ones, that type of thing, with the ultimate goal of kind of migrating these projects. Parata is not going to completely go away, but what it's going to do is become a fingerprinting engine. We're going to build it so that it'll actually go out there. It'll do all the fingerprinting, identifying the devices, and then when it has a match, it'll actually call Metasploit to actually run the specific modules. And that way we can move the whole Metasploit development, hacking, information gathering over to Metasploit, which is a much better fit for it. But Metasploit's not necessarily a scanning tool. It's not going to automatically fire it up and just scan your network and own everything. It's not typically going to do that. Since this is an information gathering thing that we target on this type of stuff, we're going to automate that with the new Parata that's going to come out next year to do that scanning part of it for us. So modules we have created so far, we have a Xerox LDAP passback module, we have a Konica address extraction, we have a Canon address book extraction, and we have the Dell HP username extractions. This actually turns out you can actually see it a little better. Here's the actual modules running. I know this is a lot of information, but to view, but this is the HP module actually being run in Metasploit, and it shows some of the usernames that were actually found, and it writes them all out to a text file for later parsing type thing. I guess we have some arrows to that. This here is the Canon address book, and again, here we go. Here's the password. This was actually live ran in a real environment that we were lucky to get access to as we were developing this stuff, so you can see how that works there. We come over to the Konica Minolta. Again, we're able to actually pull the passwords. Here it's there's the password, but it'll go through and pull all the passwords out of that particular device. So if there's multiples, it'll show all of them. Extract the admin password. So this is the passback attack that we've actually automated as a Metasploit module. So it's kind of cool. It'll tempt the password 1111, but you can change that to some other password. An example, if you find a device that you want to get into, you use the hack that I showed you to get the password. And, well, we actually have written a Metasploit module to do that. So that's pretty good. And there it is right there. So we're able to pull the password. Additional Metasploit modules, they're in the works. We have a number of them we're still working on. Hopefully those will come out soon. Here's where you can get them at. So if you go to that one, that'll be a lot of the team I'm on, the pen test team, some other stuff that's sitting in there. But there'll be a Prey-to-sploit in there. So if you go to the Prey-to-sploit, there's like 7 or 8 modules. They're not in the prime system, they're still beta. I suggest if you want to run them, try running them in your environment. Please do give us feedback. They're typically not going to hurt. They're not going to hurt anything. I can assure you that. All of this attack surface here is generally automating web browsing and parsing the web pages to get the data. Is mainly what we're doing. So there's no real vicious attacks taking place here. So then we get into, and I guess I have just a couple minutes left, securing your environment. Obviously, how do we secure this? And this is real simple. You know, let's change the default passwords on all your devices. So if you happen to have a Xerox, change your password to something that's not just 4-digit number, because that's lame and stupid. But also turn off the actual firmware upgrades. There, you can go to a location in there where it says firmware, and you can check a box that says disable firmware. Now, if you need to update firmware, you can put it back on, do the firmware upgrade, turn it back off. But if you change your password and don't disable firmware upgrade, you haven't accomplished anything in that case there. Patch management, which no one does patch management. And then, like I said, on the password. So question here is, how many people here work for companies that before any multifunction printer device or any embedded device is deployed within your environment, specifically multifunction printers, are you required by policy to change the password to something that's not default before it's deployed? Okay, so everyone look around. There's just not a lot of hands there, and this is very common. We're seeing more and more of it. I think the last place I spoke, there was like 3 or 4 hands in there too, and most of them had seen my presentation before and went back and changed policy. Is that what you guys did? Okay. Don't expose to the internet. I love finding printers exposed to the internet as a pen tester. It's just field day. They can be fun. And probably the half dozen occurrences where I've seen that, I've gotten passwords off of it and I've gotten usernames. But it's amazing. You get these small, stupid printers set up on the internet, and I think more than 3/4 of them, somebody in a company set the thing up for corporate functions, and then they actually used their Google email address, their personal email address, in case there was issues to email them, and their password. So I had all that stuff. Function isolation. Again, it's always good to isolate printers. So if you have printers that are like payroll, HR, you can isolate those. Not everyone in your environment needs to get access to those. Those are payroll and HR printers. And it's common, what do they print? Payroll and HR data. And we've actually, a number of occasions, one occasion we actually found one that was a payroll printer. We used a attack where we went into it. We were able to pull the passwords out. It was actually, the passwords were actually in the source. That username and password gave me access to a folder that was a payroll folder. Turns out that all the scan jobs off the payroll printer went to the payroll folder. And it was also nice enough, it was the same place where they put all the backups for the payroll database. So I was able to extract the entire payroll database off for a large, I don't know, 3,000 or 4,000 employee company, get it running up on my machine and actually pull everything about every employee off their system. I bet you they're not doing that anymore. So any questions? And here's some of my contact information, and this is where you can get the tools. You can also get Preda, the tool itself, which is probably the more ready for prime time, from my Twitter, or from my Git, and I'm not sure if I put that out here. Hold up, let me find it because I want you to get that. Now, apparently I didn't bother putting it in here, or the guy I was working with took it out because he thought it'd be funny. Okay, but if you go to my GitHub, which is PERCX, or search for Preda, you'll find that. It's a Perl program. Give it a whirl. It's a command line type program. It's easy to install the modules that are needed to make it run. They're in the README file, what you actually need to do. So any questions? Any feedback? At least no one threw any beer bottles at me. I guess that's an improvement. Yes, sir.
So, what do you do when the son of a bitch prayer cat comes out and resets your password back to 138?
So the thing is are they contracted to take care of them? It's only a service contract. Call them. I mean, it's fairly simple. It's a contract, right? Define that in the contract. I tell every company that. If you contract all of your printers out there, what you need to do is set in the contract what they need to do, that they need to set passwords that meet your company policy on printers that are sitting on your network. More than likely, what your printer tech did was upgrade the software. A number of these devices, when you upgrade the software, the firmware on the devices, will reset the password back to factory. So probably the best thing to do is try to identify when they're going to be doing that so that you guys can make corrective action. Because he may not have known. He may have just, like I said, as soon as he installed the software, he walks out the door. And I know a number of the vendor software overwrites all of those back to defaults. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Here, take your microphone off. Yeah.
Okay.